What is going on, everyone? My name is Anton and we're back with a brand new video. So in this video I'm going to go ahead and teach you all how to create a ticket system. It's going to have all of the main functionalities such as creating the ticket, closing the ticket. It's also going to make sure that the ticket is only going to be seen by the person who created it, as well as the other other administrators of the server. So I'll show you how it works and then we'll get into the tutorial. So the way that it's supposed to work is you're going to click on create ticket and it's going to go ahead and create a ticket channel. And you can see that only myself, the owner of the server, or any other admin and the Discord bot can actually see this ticket channel. And I can go ahead and just say hello, and I can type a bunch of stuff and I can talk to other staff members. And then once I'm done, I can go ahead and click on close ticket and it'll close the ticket for me. And then it'll be completed. And then we can go ahead and create another ticket if we need to. Okay, so we're going to cover all the basics of creating this ticket bot, and in a later episode, what we'll do is we'll do more advanced stuff, such as creating transcripts and then building out an actual user interface for that. So I hope you all will enjoy this video because it's going to be a very long tutorial, but I hope you all have fun. So let's go ahead and jump right into the tutorial. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started by creating our project folder. So we're going to do everything from scratch, but I will have timestamps so you all can skip through certain things, or I'll make this a series, who knows. But the first thing that we'll do is I'll create a folder and I'll call this discord.js ticket system. I'll just call it ticket bot project. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I'm going to end up having multiple different projects inside this folder. So I just want to make sure that we keep everything organized, because we will be building an actual user interface application with OAuth 2, but that's later on. We're not going to worry about that right now, and this is totally optional. It's only if you want to have the transcripts feature. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just clear, and what I'll do next is I'll create another folder and I'll call this ticket bot, and then we'll cd into that folder. And I'm going to type npm init-y to initialize this project with npm, and also so that we create a package.json file. And then I'll go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code. So let me just move that over here. Perfect. All right, next what we'll do is we'll install our dependency. So I will be building this entire project with TypeScript. I won't be using JavaScript at all. So npm i-d TypeScript, and let's just go ahead and install .env for environment variables. And I think we'll need to install TS Node as well. So now that we've installed our dependencies, let's go ahead and type npx tsc -- init. So if you already have TypeScript installed globally, you can just do tsc --init. But if you want to run the local version of TypeScript, you can just use npx. And this will run your local binaries that are all installed inside this bin folder. You can see that we have the tsc script installed. We also have ts node. And we have a bunch of other stuff that was, I guess, installed as a subdependency. But let's type npx tsc --init, and this will create a tsconfig file for us, which we will need to configure later on in the tutorial. Alright, so now that we have our tsconfig file, the next thing that we'll have to do, of course, is install the main dependencies. So that includes discord.js, and then we're also going to install the REST package, so at discord.js -rest. And I think that should be it for this whole video. Or not this whole video, this just to get our bot set up. Okay, cool. So let's go into our package.json file and we'll set up a start script. And what we'll do is, so this is going to, since we're using TypeScript, we're going to create a start script that is just going to run the index.js file. And this index.js file is basically the compiled version of the project. Because remember, we're building everything in TypeScript, and it's going to get compiled down to JavaScript. So inside the tsconfig folder, we're going to configure that real quick. We want to go ahead and look for the outer property. So let me search for that. And then you want to uncomment this, and then you want to set the path to the name of the output folder, and that just means where all of the build files will go. So I'm just going to call it lib. Some people call it dist, like D-I-S-T, but you can call it whatever you want. It doesn't really matter, honestly. So we just call it lib. And so whenever we compile our code, it's going to generate all the files, all the compiled code inside this lib folder. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder called source. And inside the source folder, I'll create a new file called index.ts. And let me show you what happens when we compile the code. So what I'll do is I'll create a script called build, and that's just going to use the tsc command and then dots. Actually, we don't even need the dot actually, because we're going to be running the script from the root directory, so that will just compile every single thing from there. We'll create one more script called start prod or start dev, and this is going to use nodemon, and we're going to need to install that. And nodemon basically just restarts your application whenever changes are made. So let's pass the path to index.ts like this, because that is the file that we're going to run. And let me also just install nodemon as well, because I forgot to do that. Alright, and let's just go ahead and run the build script, and let's see what happens in our project. You can see that a lib folder was generated, and we have the index.js file. Okay, once we actually write more code, this index.js file will have all of the compiled code, and whenever we run npm start, it's just going to execute this command, npm start. And you can see that all it does is it just does the same thing as if we were to normally run it ourselves using the node command. It does node and then the path to the index.js file. So we're pretty much done with setting up all of these things. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started with writing some code. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to get the bot to log in, and then we're going to go ahead and register some slash commands, or one slash command. So we'll import the client class from discord.js, and then we'll create an instance of the client class. And then for the client options, we just need to pass in intents. For the intents, I will actually pass in, I think maybe a couple, but we're going to use the gateway intent bits enum, so that way we can actually get the enumerated values. So I'm going to pass in guilds, and I think that might be all we'll need for now. We might need later on we might need more, but this is enough for now. So let's go ahead and call client.login, and we're going to need to pass in a bot token. So what I'm going to do for the bot token is I'm going to store the bot token inside an environment variable, and that is obviously the purpose of our .env package that we had installed. So let me first create a new file called .env, and I'll go ahead and declare a couple of environment variables. So I'll declare one as bot token, and I'm also going to set the client ID in here. Or actually, you know what? I'm just going to only store the bot token, actually. So on my developer portal, I'm going to go ahead and copy the application ID, and that's just going to be the client ID, which we'll need later when we need to install, or not install, register slash commands. So const client ID is equal to client ID, the value over here. We're going to store that in a variable, and let me go ahead and just grab the bot token. So select bot, I'm going to click on reset token, copy that, and let's just go ahead and store that for the bot underscore token environment variable. Next, what I'm going to do is up top here, I'll import .env config. And what should happen is that should invoke the config function, and we should be able to have our environment variables loaded into memory. And we can test this out by logging process.env bot underscore token. because it's going to go ahead and load all of the environment variables defined in here into memory, and it's going to store it inside this global process.env object. So let's go ahead and run our code. Let me just comment this part out because I don't want to log the bot in yet. Let's just do npm run start :dev. So we're going to run the dev script. And you can see that right over here, the token is being logged. Okay, so that's good because we are importing this config. So this is actually a function that's just going to get invoked as soon as we import it. Okay, so it just loads it into memory. Okay, so that's good. Now we can go ahead and actually pass the token in and log the bot. So I'm going to take this environment variable and I'll store it in a token, or I'll store it in a variable called token, just like that. And I'm going to take that variable, I'm going to pass it in to the login method so we can actually log the bot in. Okay, and our bot should be online right now. If we go over to our Discord server, we should see that the coffee bot is online, which is good. Okay, so what we're going to do next is we're going to go ahead and create an instance of the REST client. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and declare a variable called REST, and we're going to create an instance of the REST class. So the REST class is going to be imported from the Discord.js package. So we'll import that. And then for the options, we'll set the version to version 10. And then finally, we'll just call the setToken method, and we'll pass in the token just like this. Or wait, whoops, I did not mean to do that. Or actually, wait, let me just move the declarations of these two variables a couple lines up. And it's complaining because, or actually, yeah, I think it's complaining because it's saying that this value is possibly undefined. So I'll just use the exclamation mark to assert that we know that this will always be defined. Okay, so we're assuming that's the case. But I will also leave the declarations up top here, because if we have it underneath here, it's going to not recognize the variable because we are trying to reference it before declaring it. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a function, and we're going to call it main. And this is just going to be a function that will invoke whenever we run this file. So we're going to wrap everything inside this function, everything that we want to do, such as logging the bot in, creating the slash command, and registering it with the API. Okay, so we'll create a try catch. So basically, if any errors do happen, we can log the error and handle it accordingly. But let's move the login method call inside the try. Okay, and what we want to do is we want to go ahead and register our slash commands. Okay, so the way to do that is we need to call rest.put, and this is just going to make a put request to a specific endpoint. Now, what's the endpoint that we need to call in order to register the slash commands? Well, we don't need to worry about what the endpoint URL exactly is, because we can actually use this routes object, and this object has a method called application guild commands with an S. And when you invoke this method, it's going to go ahead and return to you a formatted URL that is the correct URL to call to update your application guild commands. It'll also register too. If the guild commands does not exist, it'll pretty much create a new one. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and pass in the application ID and the guild ID. Okay, so first let's pass in the application ID, which is our client ID. And then next we need our guild ID. So make sure you have a Discord server, obviously. We're going to right click on copy ID, and I'll store this in a variable up top here, just like that. And then we'll pass the guild ID variable as the second argument for the application guild commands method. So this is just going to give you a URL, okay? And we can console log it. And you don't really even need to use this method if you want to format your URL yourself, but this is just a handy tool or a handy method that the Discord.js library provides for you. But you can see over here that this is the endpoint slash applications slash, and then that's our, I think that's our application ID. Yep, and then slash guilds. and then slash guild ID, and then commands. Okay, so now we need to pass in a request body for the rest.put method. And the request body is going to need a array, or actually an array, of application commands in JSON format. Okay, so the body property is going to be an array, and inside here is where we're going to have all of our slash commands that we want to register. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to declare a variable called commands, and I'm going to assign it to an empty array, because what we'll do is we will go ahead and just create all of our application commands in here, and we'll just assign commands to body. Alright, now to get rid of this annoying squiggly line, basically it's complaining about how it has implicitly type any. So the actual type for this is the REST post API application commands JSON body type, which is imported from Discord.js and has to be an array. Okay, but if this confuses you, you could just do any if you want to, but I would not recommend that. And what we're going to do next is we're going to go ahead and create our slash command, which is just going to allow administrators to set up the ticket bot. Okay, so whenever they add the bot to the server, we're going to give them a command that they can use that will fully initialize the ticket bot, and it's ready to go ahead and create tickets. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new instance of slash command builder. And then we'll go ahead and call the set name method. And the name of this method will be called setup. And we're going to call the description. We'll just call this initializes the ticket bot and sends a message to a channel for customers to create tickets. Okay. And then we're going to also want to add permissions, because we don't want everyone able to use the command. So for the permissions, we can go ahead and set default permissions. And what we can do here is we can just set the permission bit fields flags. So I'll show you how that works. So permissions bit field, which is going to be imported from the Discord.js package. And then we're going to go ahead and call or reference the flags property. And then we're going to go ahead and select the permission that we want. So the permission that I want is administrator. So only the admin can see and use this command. So after setting the default member permissions, the next thing that we want to do is we want to go ahead and add a channel option. Because what's going to happen is the bot is going to go ahead and send the initial message to the channel. And remember, that message is going to have the button attached to it, which then customers or users can click on the button and it'll create the private ticket channel. So we're going to call add channel option, and we're going to pass in a callback function. And the argument is the slash command channel option object. And then we can go ahead and set the options properties. So we'll set the name of this option, set it to channel, set description, the channel to send the message to, set required to true, and then we'll add the channel types. And this is just going to only allow specific channel types. So I only want guild text channels because it makes sense to only have text channels. So we'll do channel type, and this is an enum imported from Discord.js. So I'm gonna import that up top over here, and then dot guild text. Okay, and then finally we're gonna go ahead and call the toJSON method, and you'll see that if you hover over this, the toJSON method returns REST post API application commands JSON body type, which is the reason why we type annotated this commands variable. Okay, and that's actually how I figured out what the type was I just hovered over it, I looked at the type, and I just copied it and I just pasted it here, and then made it an array. Okay, so I think this will be one of the only slash commands that we will create for this tutorial series. We might create more, but let's not worry about that right now. Okay, so we're done with creating a slash command. Let's look at our logs, and I think our bot might actually be already logged in. I'm not sure. Let me go ahead and just exit out of the application. And I'm going to go ahead and register the ready event on the bot itself. So that way I know when the bot has actually logged in. So let's do that. Client.user.tag. Wait, there we go. All right, so let's start the bot up and let's see what happened. Okay, there we go. So the bot has logged in, and let's see if our slash command is there. And we can see that, yep, it's right over here. And you can see that it also filters out all of the non-text channels. It only gives us guild text channels. And I can select any channel I want to have the message sent to. Okay, and only I, as the administrator, or any other administrator could see the command. But if you're not an administrator, if you don't have the admin permission, then you cannot see the command or use it. Okay, so now that we have created the slash command, the next thing that we need to do is we need to actually handle the interaction. So whenever we send the command to the chat, we need to handle the interaction by listening to the interaction create event. And then from there, we're going to want to check to see if the command name is the setup command, because we might have multiple slash command names. And then from there, we want to go ahead and send a message to the channel, or whichever channel the user wants to send it in. So what we'll do is we'll listen to the interaction create event. So we'll reference client, call the on method, and we'll listen to interaction create. This is going to take in a callback function as a second parameter, and the callback function has the interaction object. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to emit some custom events because, like I said, we're going to have a bunch of different stuff happening, and I want to make our code look as clean as possible. So here's what I'll do. We know that with interactions, there's always going to be different types of interactions that could happen. There could be chat commands, there could be button interactions, there could be modal submissions, etc., etc. Right? We know that whenever the user sends the setup command, that's going to be a chat input command. Okay? So what I'll do is I'll do this. We'll write an if condition, and we'll say if interaction is chat input command. So we'll call that method. And if this returns true, I'm going to go ahead and emit a custom event. And I wonder if this will even allow me to do this. I think we should be able to. So we'll call this chat input command like this. And then for the arguments, we'll pass in the client as well as the interaction object. So we're just doing this so that way we don't have to handle every single thing inside the interaction create event. Because this event can be very, very big. We can receive so many different interactions, and it can do a lot of different things at the same time. Picture this interaction create event as the message create event, but for interactions, right? You want to have some kind of handler. Now, I don't have any command handler right now, but if you do, you can go ahead and configure it to work with this code. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new folder, and I'll call this events. And actually, no, I'll call this handlers. Okay, and I'll create a new file, and I'll call this chat input command.ts. So I'm just going to name this exactly what the event name is called, so chat input command. We're going to want to actually register this chat input command as a listener, so we'll have to do client on chat input command like this. And then we're going to pass in a function that's going to handle this event, right? Because if we're emitting an event, we need to also listen to it in order to actually consume the event and do something with it. So for the function, we're going to create that function over here. So we'll do export async function, handle chat input command. And let's just go ahead and take this, and let's import that into the index.ts file. So that was imported from handlers/chat input command. Okay, so when we emit this event, it's going to be received, and then we're going to go ahead and call this function. And because we're passing in 2 arguments, this function is going to take in 2 arguments. So it's going to take in the client, which is a client instance, and then it will take in the interaction type or interaction object. And the type for this is an interaction, which is a generic, and I think it's cache type, like that. There we go. And what I can do now is I can go ahead and say handle chat input command, and I'll console log both of the arguments just so that you can see that it should not be null or undefined. So let's go ahead and try this out so you can see how everything works. So our bot's logged in. Let's do /setup. And you can see that in the logs, right? You can see that literally everything is here. Okay, you can see that right over here, we have handle chat input command being logged, which is coming from over here. And we have the client instance being logged as well. And as you saw earlier, we scrolled up, but we have the chat input command interaction being logged. So we know that this works, okay? So every single time we receive the interaction create event, we're going to check if the interaction is a chat input command. And if it is, we'll just fire our own custom event, okay? And in order to actually receive those events, we need to listen, we need to register that event as well by calling client.on, passing the name of that event, and then passing the callback function that will handle that event. Okay, and since we are passing 2 arguments for this event right over here, the callback function is expected to have 2 arguments. Okay, and those will just literally be exactly what we passed in. I know it might be a little bit weird, but like I said, we need to do this because we don't want our code to be messy, but we don't necessarily need to do it because you can do it however you want. But I think this is one way that you could do it. Okay, you could also just, instead of firing an event, you could also just call a function. But I think working with custom events is good anyways. Just make sure that the custom event name that you are going to use doesn't conflict with any of the other events. Okay, in our situation, it doesn't. So let's handle the interaction, the chat input interaction now. So what we want to do inside this function is we want to go ahead and check what the command name is, because we might have different command names later. So what we'll do is we'll use switch case, and the condition will be the interaction.command. Whoops. Wait, give me a second. Actually, I need to change the type of this real quick, because we know that this is going to be a chat input command interaction and not just a regular interaction. And the reason why we need to change this because otherwise you can see that right over here, if I try to reference interaction dot command name, it doesn't appear. Okay, but we know that when it calls this function, we know it's a chat input command. So let's just change the type real quick to chat input command interaction, and most specifically it's a chat input command interaction, which is a generic type, and we have to pass cache type. So let's import this from Discord.js, cache type like this, and let's remove interaction like that. Okay, so now we can go ahead and reference interaction.command name. Okay, we know that this object is going to be a chat input command interaction because we already wrote the if condition here. So there's no point in rewriting the if condition again. Okay, so let's go ahead and set a case. So the first case will be setup, and if we had more slash commands, we would just add more cases. Okay, so inside this setup case, what exactly do we want to do? Well, whenever the user fires the command, what's supposed to happen is it's supposed to send the message to the channel. But here's the thing though, right? We don't want the user having multiple different messages that customers or users can interact with to create tickets, right? You really only should have one dedicated message in a proper channel that users will be able to see and then they can interact with, right? Now, in order to save the state of knowing that there's already a message that the administrator has configured, we need a database for this. So I won't set up the database right now. What I'll do is I'll go ahead and create the message, I'll send it, and then we'll go ahead and configure the database. Regardless though, we will need a database in the end because that's how we're going to be able to create tickets and then save them to the database. And also when we'll need to set up our transcripts, we'll need a database to fetch tickets as well, and also save all the messages. So let's first just create the message and send it to the channel. So here's what I'm going to do. The first thing that I'm going to do is to send the message to the channel. We want to actually get the channel. So how do we do that? Well, remember that this / command setup takes in an argument, or I should really just call them a channel option. Okay, so if I do / setup and then the channel itself, if I hit enter, right, I'm going to get a channel option. Okay, so to actually get the correct channel that they had passed in for that option, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and reference interaction.options, and then we want to go ahead and call get channel. Okay, and we're calling get channel because this is going to give us the channel object itself as well as the correct data type of the channel. So we'll go ahead and pass in the name of the option, and in our situation we named the option channel. Okay, so whatever you name the option is what you're going to pass in right over here. Okay, so options.getChannel and then the name. And then since we are using TypeScript, it actually doesn't even infer the type properly for us, because the correct type is actually supposed to be a guild text-based channel. And we know that because these channels are always going to be text-based. So I'm going to go ahead and do as guild text-based channel like this. Okay, and finally what we'll do is we'll assign this to a variable. So const channel, just like that. Or actually I need to move this up top over here. Sorry about that. All right, there we go. So we're going to get the channel, and then we should be good. Or actually, no, I'm going to move this. Actually, no, this is wrong. Sorry about that. I need to move this inside the case like that. Excuse me. All right, perfect. Cool. So now that we get the channel, we're going to go ahead and send a message to the channel. Okay. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go ahead and do this. We're going to reference the channel, and then we're going to go ahead and call .send. And then we want to go ahead and send something to the channel, which is just going to be a custom message, which you can write whatever you want. You can even send an embed message if you want to. I'm not going to. I'm just going to send a regular string. And I'm just going to say interact with the buttons to either create or manage a ticket. Okay, and then we're going to need to pass in the components property. And this is where we're going to need to add our component, which is going to be a button. Now I'm only going to add, I think, maybe one component, which is just going to be a button. Now in order to add buttons need to belong inside an action row. So we'll need to create an action row first. So I'm going to create an instance of that, and I'm going to call it action, or I'm not going to call it, the type is action row builder. And this is a generic type. We are using TypeScript too, so we're going to have to actually explicitly set the generic type. Okay, otherwise it's going to complain, and you'll see in just a second. So I'm going to go ahead and call set components, and then I'm going to pass in the button builder instance. So new button builder, and remember these classes are imported from the Discord.js package. So we're going to set the custom ID, which is very important. This custom ID is going to allow you to know which button the user clicked on, because like I said, you might have many different types of button interactions, and in order to know which button the user clicked on and what it's supposed to belong to, like what category or what kind of action it's supposed to perform, you would need to reference the custom ID, right? So for the custom ID, we're going to set this to create ticket. And I'll go ahead and set an emoji as well. And I'll go ahead and just copy a Unicode ticket emoji right over here. You can pass in whatever emoji you want. And I'll set the label to create ticket. So this is what This is what the text will look like. And then finally, we'll set the style to button style dot, and I'll do primary. Okay, and you can see right now it's giving us this red line, like it's complaining about this whole thing, and we just need to set the type to button builder, because inside the action role we have a button, so we're gonna set this to button builder. Okay, so we're done with this. Now let's go ahead and do one more thing, and let's actually reply to the interaction. So let's do this. So I'm going to go ahead and await this channel.send call. And right underneath here, we'll do await interaction.reply. And we'll just say the message was sent. Or let me actually do this. The message was sent in. And we'll also tag the channel. And we'll make this interaction message ephemeral, which means that only the user who executed the command will see it. So let's go ahead and test this out. Let's wait for the bot to relog. And let's go into our server. And let's do /setup. Let's do the menu channel. Okay, and you can see that the message is there. And you can see it says interact with the buttons to either create or manage ticket. And now, when I click on this button, it's going to go ahead and fire an interaction create event, but we're not handling it right now because it's a button interaction. Okay, so we're done with setting the message. The next thing that we'll need to do is we'll need to set up the database. So we'll do that right now. We'll connect to the database, and whenever we are trying to set up the bot, what we'll need to do is we'll need to query the database to check to see if the guild already has a configuration. And if the guild does not have a configuration, we'll create a brand new one, and we'll store the message ID. We'll also store the channel ID as well. So that will be the channel of where the message was sent in. And we'll also store other things too, like the guild ID and other important values. Okay. And so if the guild configuration does exist, and we know that the administrator has set up the ticket bot, and we can perform a bunch of different actions. We can say, hey, do you want to override the previous message? Do you want to delete this one, etc., etc. Okay, I'll leave like these custom scenarios up to you all to configure, but we're just only going to just make it so that if it does have an existing guild config, we'll just replace the current message ID with the new one. Okay, so let's go ahead and set up our database connection. Alright, so for the database, we are going to be using MySQL. Now, I would highly recommend you use a SQL database over MongoDB. And we're going to go ahead and connect to the database. So, before you continue, make sure you install MySQL. Okay, you can also use PostgreSQL. You can use, I think, MariaDB, I think. You can also use, I forgot what the other, I think you can use Oracle and Microsoft SQL Server. Because we're going to be using the TypeORM library to connect to the database, and TypeORM supports many different types of SQL databases. So, make sure you have MySQL installed. Okay, I have a video on my channel that shows you how to install MySQL, but you can also just look one up on YouTube or Google it, and you can just follow along with those instructions. It's fairly easy. But if you have any issues, join my Discord server, and I'll be more than happy to help you all. So assuming that you have MySQL already installed, let's go ahead and go into our console, and we're going to install a couple of dependencies. We're going to install TypeORM. So this is the library that's going to take care of mapping our classes to actual database tables. Okay, so if you've never used ORMs before, they're really amazing tools. You don't need to worry about writing actual database statements. Like, you don't actually have to write query statements. You can just use the actual language. Like, for example, we're using TypeScript. So I can just write TypeScript to interact with the database. Okay, so there's a lot of things that ORMs do, but I'm not going to go in depth into that. So we'll install TypeORM. We also want to install the database driver. So since I'm using MySQL, I'm going to install the MySQL 2 package, and I'm going to install a package called reflect metadata. Okay, so once that's done installing, what we'll need to do is we'll need to configure a couple things in our application. But let's just wait for it to finish installing before we continue. Okay, I think it may have frozen over there, so I had to like just type something. There we go. So we install our packages. Let's go into our tsconfig.json file, and we need to enable a couple of things. So we need to search for the decorator configurations. So I'll just do Control F, decorator. So right over here, you see where it says experimental decorators. You want to uncomment this, or if you don't have it in your config file, just make sure you add this experimental decorators. Set this to true. So this will allow you to use decorators, which we'll need with type ORM. And then you want to also use emit decorator metadata. So make sure this is uncommented, or just make sure you have this as a property set to true. Okay, so we're done configuring the tsconfig file. Next thing that we'll do is inside our main file, so index.ts, all the way at the top, we're going to go ahead and import reflect metadata. Okay, so those are the two things that you must do if you want to use type ORM. Otherwise, you will run into issues. Okay, the next thing that we will need to do is we'll need to actually connect to our database. So the way that we do this with type ORM is we're going to need to create a data source. So I'm going to create a new folder, and I'll call this type ORM, and I'll create a new file, and I'll call this, I'll just call this index.ts. And I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'll create a data source that we're going to export, so we can import this wherever we want in our application. So export const, and I'll just call this app data source equals new data source. Okay, and then inside the data source options object, we need to pass in our configuration for our database, as well as for type ORM. So for example, the first thing that we'll set is the type, and you can see that there's many different types. MongoDB also actually works with type ORM, so you can use MongoDB if you want to. But you can see that you can also use Oracle, you can use Aurora, you can use Postgres, you can use literally a lot of different. You can even use SQLite too. So if you want to have like if you want to use like a small database like SQLite, you can use that as well. But I'm gonna just select MySQL, and then what I'm gonna do next is I'm gonna go ahead and set the host. So you can also configure all these things inside the environment variable. So that's what I'll do. So let me just set the host. So let me do this. So MySQL DB host, and we're just going to set it to localhost, MySQL DB port. For the port, I'm just going to set this to 3306 because that's the default port. For the username, I'm going to just type my username, so that's test user. For the password, it's test user 123, and of course you're going to put your own credentials. Okay, and I think the database name is the next one, so I'll call this variable database. And for the name, I'll just call this ticket system DJS. I'll just call this ticket bot 2022, I guess. You can name this whatever you want, but I'll just name it this for now. And I think these are all the properties we'll need. So we'll go ahead and do this. Process.env .mysql db host and port process env mysql db port. Now it is going to complain about this because it's supposed to be a number, so you can just do parse int, which will convert that to a it'll convert it from a string to a numeric type. But it's also going to complain about how this might be undefined, so you can just do this, or you can just do or 3306 like this. But I think it might just be better to just manually just type in the port like this if you want to. Okay, but we'll just leave it like this for now. Let's set the username. So process.username .env.mysql db username, password, process.env mysql db password, and then database, process.env mysql db database. So we're done with the credentials for the database. The next thing that I'll set is synchronize. We want to set this to true. So every single time we make updates to our type ORM entities, it will actually reflect in the actual database tables as well. And you'll see that in a second. And the last property that we'll set is the entities property. So this is an array of entities that we want to register. So right now we don't have any, but we're going to have to create some. And once we successfully create the entities, we will just pass them as a type inside this array. Okay, so we're done with setting up the data source. The next thing that we'll do in order to actually connect to our database, or I should say initialize, is we need to go ahead and reference the app data source variable, and we need to call the initialize method. So let's go into our async function. This is our main function over here. And one thing that I forgot to do was I forgot to actually await this REST output call, because this is actually asynchronous. So let's do that. And let's also go ahead and type await. So we're going to import app data source. So that's going to be imported up top over here. And then we're going to call initialize. And this returns a data source. Okay. And what I'll do is I'll just store this in a variable and I'll just log it so you can see what it looks like. Okay. And just to also make sure that the database connection was successful. So let's run our application right now. Let's just make sure nothing goes wrong. Okay, so right now, as expected, it's going to throw an error and it says unknown database, and that's because we don't have this database in our actual MySQL server. So let's go ahead and log into our SQL server. So I'm just going to log into my SQL server using the command line interface. But you can also use MySQL Workbench. You can use whatever GUI you want. If you install MySQL using the MySQL installer, you can also install the MySQL command line tool. But I can just type MySQL-u, the name of my username, test user -p, and I'll just type the password. And I'm logged in, and I'm going to create the database by typing create database and then the name of the database. So in our case, the name of the database is Ticketbot 2022. Okay, and it's a good thing that we know that the database connection was able to, so it was able to log in with the correct credentials. It's just that it couldn't connect to the database itself because it did not exist. Okay, but if I were to restart the application, you can see that there shouldn't be any issues right now. Okay, you can see that the data source is being logged and all of our properties are there, which is good because that means our environment variables are obviously working clearly. Okay, and you can see that is initialized is set to true. So now we can actually reference app data source anywhere in our code, and we can go ahead and perform operations with the database. So let me go ahead and just delete this console log because we don't need that, and I'll just delete this as well because we won't really need the instance of whatever initialize returns anyways. Okay, one more thing that I want to call out is make sure, like I said, make sure the .env config is imported all the way at the top level, because if I actually imported this after data source, the data source would have not even recognized these environment variables. So I figured I would mention that just in case if you all might have some issues with environment variables being undefined. Okay, but if you follow along with everything, everything should work fine. So now that we have successfully connected to the database, we can actually start performing operations to the database. But before we can do that, we need to go ahead and create an entity. And basically the entity is going to represent a database table, right? In our situation, we're going to create a table that's going to store the configuration for the guild for our ticket bot. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new folder inside the type ORM folder, and I'll call this entities. Okay, and then what I'm going to do inside this folder is I'll create a new file and I'll call this ticket config.ts. And to create an entity, we'll create a class, and we'll name the class whatever we want. I'll call it ticket config. And we want to go ahead and use the entity decorator. And this is going to mark this class as a type ORM entity. Okay, so when we actually register this entity, type ORM will synchronize this class, and it's going to take all of the properties, all the fields that we defined in this class, and it's going to create a brand new table with each column mapping to the property that we defined in this class. And you'll see that in a second. So let's go ahead and do this. Let me pass in some options, and I want to set the name of this entity to just ticket configs, like that. So let's continue. So every single record for our ticket config is going to have a primary key. So the primary key is going to be ID, and the type is going to be a numeric value. And I'm going to use the primary generated column annotation, so that way type ORM knows that this is going to be an auto-incremented primary key. Okay, and we're getting this issue right over here. It's saying that ID has no initializer. So I'm just going to go ahead and go into tsconfig, and you don't have to do this. You can just set it to like a default value like this if you want to. But I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go ahead and disable the strict property initialization property to false, because I don't want to deal with those issues right now with TypeScript. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and use the column decorator. So this will mark a field as a column. Okay, and we're going to need the guild ID, because every single guild that uses our ticket bot is supposed to have a configuration, and this guild ID is also supposed to be a unique record as well, which means that the record in the table itself, there cannot be duplicate records with the same guild ID. So we're gonna set this to unique, unique to true, like this. We'll then use the column decorator again, and I want to set the message ID property, and the type will be string. So I'm just gonna save the message ID into the ticket configuration as well, because we might need it later on. And I'll also set one more property called channel ID. Additionally, one more thing that you could do is you can also set roles. So, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later. But basically, you can add some role IDs into this configuration. So that way, if you need to perform certain actions and you need to make sure that the user who's trying to perform said action has specific roles, you would just add that in here. Okay, so that should be it for our entity. So let's go ahead and actually register our entity. And we do that by going into our data source. Inside the entities array, we'll go ahead and pass in the ticket config class as a type. Or yeah, we're just passing this as a value, I should say. Okay, and that's going to be imported from the entities file over here. And then you can see that when I save, it's going to restart. And you're not seeing anything right now, but let's go into the database and let's see what happens. So let's copy our database name. So we already created the database ourselves. We're going to type use and then the name of the database. So we'll step into the database and let's just type show tables. And you'll see that our ticket configs table was created. If I type describe ticket underscore configs, you're going to see that every single field, let's go into our ticket config class. Every single field that we marked with the decorator was mapped to a column. We have ID, and you can see it says over here auto increment, and it's a primary key. We have guild ID, which is a unique value, message ID, and channel ID. Okay, so one more thing that I'll also do is I will do this. I will set, let's see, let me do this. Nullable, let's set this to, actually, I'll leave that alone for now. I'm just worried that it might throw an error, but I don't think it will, because we will be setting the values explicitly later anyways. So let's leave that alone. All right, so we're done with setting up the ticket config entity. So now how do we actually call the database and create records in the database. Will allow me to show you. So let's go into our chat input command.ts file, and what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and import the app data source. Then we're going to go ahead and create a variable, and I'm going to call this ticket config repository. And you're probably wondering, what exactly is a repository? Well, repositories repositories are basically like an API that allow you to communicate from from all of your business level applications, from all of your business level features and functions with the actual data source. So you can think of a repository like a middleman, and it provides an interface for you to directly communicate with the database. So instead of actually writing raw SQL queries, we use the repository API to call the database. Okay, so to get the repository, we're going to reference app data source, and we're going to call get repository. And then we're going to pass in the entity that we want to work with. In our situation, we want to work with the ticket config entity. So I'm going to pass in that as a value, and I'm going to save. So now that I have this ticket config repository, I can then take this repository and I can call methods such as find one by, I can call create, I can call delete. I can basically perform basic CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete. Okay, so that's how we're going to work with our database, by using the repository. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to modify our code just a little bit. So what we'll do is we'll first call the database. We'll search if there is already an existing configuration. Okay, so how do we search the database? Well, let's go ahead and declare a variable, and let's just call this config. I'll call this ticket config. And then we're going to go ahead and reference the ticket config repository. And I'm going to go ahead and call the find one by method. And this is going to allow us to search for one record with conditions. Okay? And the condition in our case is we're going to want to search by the guild ID. Okay, because we know that the guild ID field is supposed to be unique. Okay, so we're going to pass in guild ID, and we need to actually get the guild ID. So to get the guild ID, we can go ahead and grab that from the interaction object. So I'll go ahead and grab that up top here. So const guild ID equals interaction dot guild ID, and I'll just use the exclamation mark to assert this. I'm not sure why, in what situations it could be null, but for now I'll just go ahead and I'll just do this actually. Either it'll be the guild ID or it'll be null. Okay, or actually let me do this. Yeah, let's leave it like that. Okay, so then we'll just pass in the guild ID like this, so we can search the ticket config database table for the correct ticket configuration record. Okay, now if that ticket config does not exist, what exactly do we want to do? Well, if it doesn't exist, then we want to create it. If it does exist, then we'll update some values. Okay, so let's do this. If the ticket config, if it does not exist, okay, if it does not exist, then what we'll do is we'll send a message to the channel, and then we'll just create the ticket config inside the database. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this code. I'm going to move this up top here, and we are going to need to, I'm going to take this object over here, and I'm going to store this in a variable called message ops, short for message options. I'll just call this message options, and I'll pass it over here, because I'm going to send the message again if the ticket config does exist. The only difference is that we just are going to update the values. Okay, so that way I don't have to redefine objects and variables over and over again. So if there's no ticket config, we'll send the message to the channel, And the next thing that we'll do is we'll create a new record in the database for the ticket configuration. So we'll do const new ticket config equals, and we're going to create this record in the database by calling ticket config repository .create. Okay, so that's the name of the repository .create, and then we can just pass in the values. So we'll pass in the guild ID. Okay, we'll need the message ID, and we'll also need the channel ID as well. So how do we get the message ID and the channel ID? Well, when we send the message itself is the resolved value from the promise when you call .send. So you can see over here, when we call channel.send, it returns a promise, and that promise resolves the message object itself. And what we're going to do is we're just going to assign this whole thing to a variable, and I'll just call this message. So this will be the message that was sent, and all I need to do is I just need to reference message.id like this. And then same thing for the channel, we'll just do channel.id just like that. Okay, so we're not done yet. We need to actually save the record in the database. So what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and do this. Await ticket config repository .save, and we're going to pass in this variable. So this is an actual ticket config instance, but it has not been saved to the database. So you have to create the instance first, and then you have to call .save on the repository to actually save it to the database. Okay, so once that's done, I'll write a simple console log saved new configuration to database. And then what we'll do is we'll reply to the interaction, and we'll just say, let me actually just copy this. And I'll just say actually, let me just write this. Perfect. All right. So that's if the ticket config does not exist. So let's test this out. So we know that our ticket configuration does not exist because we don't have any right now. We have not created anything yet. Whoops. So let's go ahead and test this out. So our bot should be relogged in. Okay, let's go into our server. Let's go ahead. Let me just delete these messages. Those were from the other day. But let's go ahead and do /setup menu. Let's see. Application did not respond. That's interesting. Something went wrong, or let's see. Seems like it didn't create that. What's going on? Let's see. Oh, whoops. So over here, the find one by method call, I forgot to await this because this returns a promise. Okay. I forgot to await that. So find one by returns a promise. So let's go ahead and continue. Let's try this again. So let's do /setup menu. Ticket bot initialized, a message is sent to the channel, and if we look in our database, or let's look at the logs first, it says saved new configuration to database. We can see our configuration there. Okay, now if I were to modify our code a little bit, and if I were to do something like an else case where the ticket config does exist, I can just write something like ticket config exists, updating values. And let's save. And if we were to run this again, we would be in the else case because we do have the actual record saved to the database. Okay, so what we're going to need to do now is if the record does exist, all we'll do is we'll just send a new message and we'll just update the values in the database. Now, like I said, you don't have to send a new message, but in situations where the message might have been accidentally deleted, I would just suggest sending a new message and just updating database values. And then when you check for the button interaction, you can actually compare what the correct message that the user interacted with is. Okay, we're also going to need to check what the button ID is, but you can also check the message ID as well, which I think is something that we'll do anyways. Okay, so let's just go ahead and do /setup menu, and you can see that nothing's gonna happen in the logs. It's gonna say ticket config exists, updating values. So we're hitting this case now. So let's go ahead and handle this. So what we'll do is this: const message equals await channel.send. So we'll send literally the same exact message. Okay, so that's why I took that object and I assigned it to a variable, because I wanted to reuse it. We'll assign it to we'll create a new message. We'll send it to the channel, and then to update the ticket config, we can do it one or two ways. You can either just do ticket config and then reference the property that you want to update and assign it a new value, or you can just do ticket config repository dot update. Okay, and then this can just update it as well. You can do it either way, whatever way you feel like is better. It's up to you. But I'll just do this. Let's do this. Ticket config dot channel ID equals channel.id. So in case if the user sends it to a new channel, we'll update the channel ID, and the message ID is obviously going to be different, so we'll assign it to a new message ID. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and do this. We'll need to save, so we'll call ticket config repository dot save, and we'll pass in ticket config, just like that. So that'll update the database with new values. Okay, and once that is done, we'll just go ahead and reply to the interaction, and we'll say new message created. Let me do this. New message sent in, and then we'll do channel and updated database record, and we'll make this message ephemeral like that. Okay, and of course, if something does go wrong, we should always use try catch to handle this. So I'm just gonna take this whole if else block, or if else condition. I'm gonna wrap this all in a try catch. Okay, so if something goes wrong, we'll log the error, and we can reply to the interaction and say something went wrong. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this out. So let's wait for the bot to relog in, and then we'll go ahead and try to send a new message, and we'll pay attention to the database values. You'll see that they'll update once we have sent a new message. Okay, but like I said, this is just only one example. You can do it however you want. I think later on, we'll probably make this a subcommand, and we'll provide different options for the customer to perform on the configuration. But if you don't want to delete the message, or if you don't want to like override the existing values, you don't have to. You can just send a message to the user and say you already have a message, and then you can have them like use like a subcommand to override the current configuration. All right, so our bot has relogged in. So let's go to Discord. So let's do /setup, and we'll send the message. And you can see that it says new message sent in menu, updated database record. If I were to query the database again, you'll see that the message ID is now different. Channel ID stays the same because we did not update the channel ID. Well, we tried to update the channel ID, but we sent it in the same channel. Now, of course, if I were to send it in a different channel, like if I were to send it in roles, okay, that would be updated as well, as you can see. Okay, so we're pretty much done with the setup command. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we'll need to handle the button interaction. So that is going to require us to go back into our index.ts file. Whoop, not this one. This one. And we'll need to write an else if case, and we'll need to check to see if the interaction is a button interaction. And if it is, we'll just emit our own custom event. Okay, so I'll do that right now. So else if interaction is button. And if it is, we will emit our own custom event. And you can name this whatever you want. I'll just name this button interaction. And then for the arguments, we'll pass in the client as well as the interaction object. And then we'll do the same thing that we did for the chat input command. We need to, of course, register that event. So we'll do client on, and then we will register the same exact name. So button interaction, and we'll need a function. So we'll go ahead and create that function right now. So I'll call this button interaction TS. Okay, and then I'm gonna go ahead and just create a new function, and I'll call it handle button interaction. So export async handle button interaction, or sorry, it's export async function. Okay, there we go. And then we'll just take this, or actually let me go ahead and pass in the arguments first. So the client is the first argument, and then the button interaction is the second one. So we're going to need to get the button interaction type. So I think it's just button interaction, I think. But it's a generic, so we'll just set this as cache type, like that. Okay. And again, if you're ever confused with types in TypeScript, one thing that I like to do is I like to hover over the method call, and I like to see what the method returns. Okay, and you can see this as button interaction. So I know that this interaction type needs to be a button interaction. So that means that this type over here is going to be exactly what it is over here. Okay? Because obviously when you create a new file, it's going to be in a completely new scope, like a new file, and it's not going to recognize the variables from the other file. Okay? Unless you have it defined globally, but that's not our case. So let's go back to our index.ts file and pass in the handle button interaction function. Okay, and that's going to be imported up top over here. And now whenever we fire the button interaction event, it's going to call this function over here. And let's just go ahead and test that out real quick. Let's write a simple console log, button interaction. I'm not going to log the whole interaction object. I'll just log the custom ID. And I'll also log the message ID, because we will be checking the message ID as well, just to make sure that the user is interacting on the correct message, because you don't want users interacting on different messages, right? Even though you might actually just delete it yourself, right? But you still don't want to, because sometimes you might forget, right? But again, it's up to you on how you want to implement that. I'm just mentioning these things in case if you want to do things differently. Okay, so let's go into the console. And let's try this out. Let's just wait for our bot to restart. Okay, so right now our bot has logged in. If I go over to Discord, if I were to click on this, you can see that we have the button interaction, create ticket, everything is being logged. If I click on this, it's going to fire that as well. And you can see that the problem that I mentioned just now, you can see that every single time I click on this, we get a new create ticket interaction. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and check to see what the custom ID is. And the reason why we want to check what the custom ID is because we're going to have different buttons, and that's going to trigger the same button interaction, right? But in order to determine what functionality we want to actually perform, then we need to check the custom ID, right? Because later on, when we create the ticket, right, it's going to create a new channel, and it's going to send a message to that channel, and that message that is sent to the channel is going to have buttons attached to it, and it's going to have a delete button, so that not delete but close ticket button, and that's going to allow the user to close the ticket. So we need to make sure that we set our buttons with unique IDs, and then we need to check to see what the custom ID is, because that's going to allow us to know what we want to, what action we want to perform. Okay, so I'm going to use a switch case, and and for the condition, it will be the custom ID. So if the custom ID is create ticket, because remember that was the custom ID that we set for the button when we sent the message. So if the ID is create ticket, then we'll go ahead and continue. So what do we want to do when this is the case? Well, what we want to do is we want to actually create the ticket channel, and then we want to update the permissions of that channel. So that way only the person who's creating the ticket, as well as all of the people with correct permissions, can actually see the ticket, right? So for example, usually ticket tools usually work similar to having like an actual channel with all of the staff roles being able to see that channel. Okay, and then we'll also need to add the button to that message to allow the user to close the ticket. Okay, so let's go ahead and tackle this one by one. So if the ID is create ticket, okay, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and additionally we'll also check to see if they are interacting with the correct message. So to do that, we'll need to query the database for the ticket configuration. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's do ticket config repository equals, and then we'll reference app data source and we'll call get repository, and then we'll pass in the ticket config entity. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and search for the ticket config. And let me actually just close this out because we won't need that. So let's go ahead and reference ticket config repository. Let's call find one by, and we're going to search by the guild ID. And we'll get the guild ID up top over here. Const guild ID equals interaction.guild ID. And since this might be null, we'll just set it to an empty string if it possibly is null. Okay, so what we want to do is we'll first check to see if the ticket config exists. So, or if it doesn't exist. So if there's no ticket config, then I guess we could just return, or I'll write a simple console log, and I'll just say no ticket config exists, and we'll return. So this obviously would happen if we don't have a ticket configuration, which just basically means that the user must configure the admin must configure the ticket bot first. Okay, so here we know that the ticket config exists. So let's check to see if ticket config. Oh, I forgot to await this call. Excuse me. Ticket config.message ID. We'll check to see if the message ID matches interaction.message.id. And if it does, then that means that we know that they are interacting with the correct message, which is the latest up-to-date message. Okay? So this is important because, again, if we accidentally create a second message, we need to make sure that the user can only interact with the latest created message. Okay, so that's why we're adding this check. Okay? And what I'll do is I'll just add a console log, and I'll just say user clicked on the button on the correct message, just so that we know that they are interacting on the correct message. Okay? And once that is done, what we need to do is we just need to check to see if the user actually has a ticket. So we'll actually have to add we'll add an additional check up here. I'll just write a comment, check if user has an existing ticket. And the reason why is because you don't want the user being able to open multiple different tickets at the same time. I mean, it's up to you, like I said, but personally, I think that it shouldn't be a good idea to allow them to open, more than one ticket at a time. So I would just suggest adding a check, which we'll do in just a second. Okay, but over here inside this if condition, if they click on the button on the correct message, then what we want to do is we want to create a brand new channel. Okay, we want to set the permissions, and then in that channel, we want to go ahead and send a message to that channel and attach all of the correct buttons that we need to attach to it. So what I'll do is I'll implement that logic first, and then we'll go up a step, and then we will check to see if the user has an existing ticket. So let's go ahead and create the actual channel. So to do this, we need to reference the guild object, and we can do that by simply just doing interaction guild channels, and then we can call the create method. Now you'll notice that it automatically added this question mark for me, and the reason why is because guild could possibly be null. So in case it is null, then we'll just add this question mark. So basically, if it is in fact null, then it just won't even do anything at all. It won't even reference channels at all. It will just fail. So I think additionally what we'll do is this. I'll add an additional check. So let me grab the guild as well. Or you know what? Let me do this. Let me do this. And let me do find one guild ID or empty string. I don't really like this, but I just don't want to, get a bunch of values from the interaction object, like without destructuring it. So let's just check to see if the guild is, for some reason null, and then we'll just say guild is null. And I think the guild would usually be null is if it's not cached. I might be wrong on this, so feel free to clarify in the comments down below, but I think the guild property could be null if you don't have intents enabled. In our situation, we do have intents enabled right over here, so I think it should cache the guilds. But if you know more about that, feel free to comment down below. I'm not 100% sure though, so don't quote me on that. Okay, but that's why we're still doing this check, just to be safe. Okay, so if the guild is null, we'll just return. But if it isn't, then we can continue. So what we want to do is we want to reference guild.channels, and we want to call the create method. And this is where we're going to pass in the guild channel create options. Okay, and of course we will need to await this call because this is asynchronous, and we'll assign this return value to a variable. Okay, so for the options, we're going to need to pass in a name. So for now, I'm going to pass in ticket, and the way that we're going to name the channel is we're going to format it later with the correct ID. So for example, it's going to look something like ticket ID number 5542, and then we can also prefix it with a bunch of zeros if we want to. But in order to do this, we're going to need to actually create the ticket in the database first. So don't worry about this right now. Let me just leave it like this temporarily. The type of the channel is going to be a guild text channel. So I'm going to import channel type enum, and that's going to be imported up top over here, and we're going to reference the guild text value. We're then going to want to set the parent for the guild, for the guild ticket channel. So you don't have to set a parent if you don't want to, but I'm going to, and I'll show you how to do that. So what you can do is you can just copy the ID of the category, and then you can just set the parent property to that ID. Okay, now obviously I'm hard coding this, but I would recommend you obviously search for that channel and see if the channel ID exists, because if it doesn't exist, then I think it might not even create the channel, or maybe it will without the parent. I'm not too sure though. Okay, but definitely make sure you search for the channel first before you set the value. But let's just continue. So I'll just hard code it just to keep things simple right now. The important part here is we need to set the permissions. So we'll do that right now. So for the permissions, we want to allow the user who's creating the ticket to see the channel and send messages. So what we'll do is this is going to be an array of permission. I think it's called permission resolvables, I think. I'm not too entirely. I think it's called overwrite resolvable. Yep. And we're going to go ahead and set the allow property. And we want to allow the view channel property as well as the send messages property. Okay. Now keep in mind that for every single user or role that you set the permissions for, it's going to overwrite the previous object. Because I was playing around with these permissions, and I noticed that at first when I actually did view channel and then I pass in the ID of the user, and then in the next object I did allow view send messages, and I passed in the same ID of the user. It actually overrided the entire permissions for that user. So you have to be very careful. Okay, so since we're assigning multiple permissions for that user, we're going to assign this in an array. So we're going to just add view channel and send messages, and for the ID, it's going to be interaction.user.id. So that is the user who has interacted with the ticket or with the button. Okay. Next, we're going to need to allow the bot to obviously see the channel. So we'll do the same thing. I'll just copy and paste this. And then for the ID, we're going to need to get the bot's ID. And we can grab that by just referencing client.user.id. Now it's saying that user could possibly be null. I'm just going to assert this because I know that it's not going to be null because the bot's going to be logged in. Okay? And finally, we need to make sure that everyone else in the guild cannot see the ticket. And we do that by passing in the guild ID for the ID property. And we also need to set deny as well. So we'll do deny view channel. And we'll also deny send messages as well. But I think denying the view channel permission is more than enough because if the user can't see the channel, they should not be able to even see it to send messages. Okay. So let's set the ID to the guild ID. So we can grab that from up top over here. And it's, of course, it's complaining that it could possibly be null. I'm just going to do exclamation mark. Okay. All right, awesome. Now, one more thing that I will also mention is that if you have staff roles, like a moderator role or an admin role or a support role, you also want to add them inside here too. But of course, since you want this to work with multiple different guilds, you'll want to make sure that you don't hard code the role IDs as well. Okay, right now everything that we're doing is not hard coded for the permissions, but in a later episode, I'll show you how you can configure roles for the ticket configuration. So whenever you create the channel, it'll add the roles dynamically. So that way your staff roles will actually be able to see the actual ticket channels. Okay, so let's worry about that later. So let's go ahead and continue. So this is going to create the channel for us. And we're just going to finally send a message to that channel. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's create a variable called ticket, new ticket message. And we'll await, and then we'll get the channel. So we want to send it to the new channel we created. And we'll call that send. Okay. And what we want to do is, like I said, you can send an embed if you want to. I'm just going to send text, and I'll just say ticket menu. Okay. And then we'll set the components. And the components is just going to include a button. So we'll need to create an action role builder instance. We'll call set components. And inside the set components method, we'll pass in an instance of button builder. And for the ID for this button, we're just going to call it close ticket. Because obviously, this is going to be the case where the user can close a ticket. So when we receive the interaction, when we receive the button interaction event, we're going to create another case for close ticket. Right now we have the case for create ticket, but not close ticket. Okay, let's set the style to button style danger. Okay, and then let's set the label to close ticket. And because, like I said, we're using TypeScript and action role builder is generic, let's explicitly set this to button builder. And we are done. Okay, so let's test this out real quick. Let's just go into our console. And let's go ahead and interact with the button. Now, I'm not sure which, I think it was this one. I think this was the message that we last created. I can go ahead and double check. Yep, this is the correct one. Yep, this was the correct one. So if I were to interact with this, you'll see that it creates a new ticket for me, and it creates it in the correct category right over here. Let me zoom in a little bit. Okay. Now, obviously, if I were to create another one, it's going to keep on creating multiple different tickets over and over again. But we'll fix that by actually creating a record in the database to indicate that the user has created a ticket. Okay. And you'll see that if I try to click on any other interaction, nothing happens because we are only limiting it to this message only. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue. The next thing that we need to do is we need to create the ticket in the database. Okay, and before we can even do that, we need to create an entity for our ticket. So let's create a new file. Let's call it ticket.ts, and this entity is going to have a lot of different properties, but don't worry, it's not going to be too overwhelming. We'll create a class, class called ticket, and we'll mark this as an entity by using the entity decorator, and I'll rename this as tickets with a S. Because by default, it'll name the table exactly how the class is named, and I don't want to name the class tickets, right? So I'll just name it ticket, and then we'll label the table tickets. Okay, and let's go ahead and use the primary generated column to set up the primary key, and we'll go ahead and get a couple of values. So we'll need, I guess, the channel ID. So we'll set this to be a string. We'll need the message ID, and the message ID is just going to be the message that was sent to the ticket channel, because like I said, we need to keep track of what these message IDs are. We'll also need the created by property, and this will just be who the user, who it was that created the ticket, and that'll just be the ID of the creator. We'll also need a status property to indicate the status of the ticket, and we'll create a custom type. So what I'll do is this. Let me actually go into the source folder. I'll create a new folder called utils, and I'll create a file called types.ts, and I'll create a custom type, and I'll call it ticket status, because we will be reusing this anyways. So the status will be either opened or closed. You can have more status types if you want to, but I'll leave it just as these two for now. And let's import ticket status type. There we go. All right, perfect. Later on, we will need to modify our ticket class to support transcripts, but don't worry about that for now. Okay? So now that we've created our entity, let's go into our data source. So inside type ORM index.ts, we're going to pass in ticket, the ticket entity, inside the array of entities. And now create a new entity for us in the database. So I don't think it has successfully restarted yet, but it should restart later, but don't worry. Let's not worry about that for now, because we know that it should create it successfully without any issues. Okay, but now what we want to do is we want to revisit the button interaction event for the create ticket case, and what we're going to do is we're going to first check to see if the user has an existing ticket. If they do, then what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, look, you have a ticket that is currently open, right? You cannot create another one. Okay. If they don't have an existing ticket, then we can allow them to create one. Okay. So let me just verify that the ticket table was created. There you go. Perfect. All right. So let's go over here, and let me just exit from the bot process real quick, so that way when I try to relog in again, it won't take forever. So what we'll do is let's first get the repository, of course. So const ticket repository equals app data source get repository ticket. Okay. And then we'll go ahead and do this. Const ticket equals ticket repository find one by, because we want to search for one ticket based on some conditions. Okay. And now what we want to do is we want to search for the ticket based on the created by property as well as the status. Okay. So for created by, that's just going to be the user's ID. And we can grab the user ID by referencing interaction.user.id. And the status is going to be, for the status, we want to search to see if the user has a ticket of status opened. Okay, so let's do this. Let's do created by interaction.user.id. And then for the status, we'll search for one that's open. Because obviously if the user has a closed ticket, that means that if they only have closed tickets, that means that they can create new ones, right? But if they have at least one ticket that is opened, that means they cannot create a new one. Okay, so this database call will literally search for the database. It will search for a record that has a ticket with the correct created by ID, the user ID, and if the status is open. Okay, and if this returns null, then that means that there's no such record that exists, which means that the user can actually create the ticket. It means that they don't have an open ticket. And let's not forget to await this method call because it returns a promise. Okay, so what I'll do is if the ticket exists, we'll go ahead and reply to the interaction and we'll say you already have an existing ticket. And we'll set the message to ephemeral. And then we'll just return, I guess. Okay. And so now if they don't have a ticket, we'll create a new one. Okay. So now let's go inside this if condition over here. And right before we create the channel, we need to go ahead and create a new ticket. So we'll do const new ticket equals ticket repository dot create, and we'll pass in the values that we can pass in for now. So I think the only value that we can pass in is created by, which is going to be the interaction.user ID. And we can pass in the status, which we'll set to open. I think these are the only two properties that we can actually set for now. Or actually, you know what? I'm not going to set the status, because the reason why I won't set the status is because creating the channel could fail. So I think we could additionally add an extra status called failed. Okay, and if an error happens, we'll just set the status to failed. Okay, because obviously if the channel cannot be created successfully, which could happen if the bot is missing permissions, then that means you want to set the status to failed. Okay, or due to API issues. But we'll just set it to created by like this. Okay. Next, what we'll do, and you know what? Let me actually do this real quick. Actually, no, I'll leave it like this for now. Let's continue. So we're gonna create the ticket, and then we're gonna save it to the database. So const save ticket equals await ticket repository.save. Pass a new ticket. Okay, and now once we create the record in the database, we can actually reference save ticket, and we can actually get the actual ID of the ticket like this, right? Remember, the ID is the primary key and it's numeric, so it's going to auto increment every single time. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and go all the way on to whatever number, like I guess infinity basically. Okay, so we can format our ticket IDs to prefix it with a bunch of zeros, right? Because right now, if I were to do this, let's just restart the bot. I'll show you what the channel name would look like. So let's create a ticket. Is this the correct one, or? Oh, you know, it's complaining about the default field. So let's fix that. So yeah, I actually forgot to handle this. So because right now we're creating the record without the other fields in our database, and since these fields don't have default values, we cannot proceed. So I'll just go ahead and set the default to null. Or we'll just make it nullable, actually. Actually, created by cannot be nullable. For the ticket status, I don't really want to set the status to null, so I think what might be best is we could just set a created status and then we'll modify it later. So we'll set the default value to created. So this should fix all our issues. Okay, so let's restart the bot. And let's go back and let's click on create ticket. Now you can see that it is saying ticket -1. Okay, but we need to format it so that way it has a bunch of zeros, right? I mean, you don't have to do it, but if you would like it to look nicely formatted, you could. So to add a bunch of zeros prefix to this, all we need to do is just call the toString method, because the ID is a numeric value, it's a number type. And then we're going to go ahead and call the pad start method. And then for the max length, so this is the max length of the string you want to prefix it with. So for example, if I want to prefix it with a max length of, I guess, 6, right? So this is the length of the resulting string, right? So let's say, for example, right now the current string is length of 1. And if I set the length to 6, that means it will add 5 zeros in front of it. And you'll see that in just a second. So for the fill string, it'll be 0. Or you can do whatever. You can do pound symbols, you can do dashes, you can do whatever you want. I'll do zeros. And what's going on here? Oh, is this supposed to be? Oh, this was supposed to be a number. Okay, so watch this. I'm gonna go ahead and create the ticket, and you can see that the max length is 6. Okay, so that's what that max length property is. So it'll basically fill up the entire string with a max of 5 zeros. Okay, and obviously if we have more tickets, it's just going to fill it up with less and less zeros, right? For example, if the ID is currently 2 digits, right, it'll fill it up with 4 zeros, right? Because the max length of the string is supposed to be 6. Okay, so that's how we can format that. And okay, great. So now that we've done that part, what we need to do next after creating the actual channel and sending the message to the channel is we need to update the saved ticket object, because this is the new value, the new record in the database. So we'll reference saved ticket, and we want to update the message ID to new ticket message.id. We want to update saved. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna use a ticket repository to update this. So update the message ID. Well, actually, wait. Hold on. We need to pass in the ticket that we want to update and then the values we want to update. So I'm going to pass in save ticket. Okay. And what we'll do is we'll pass in message ID. That'll be ticket, new ticket message. .id. Channel ID. New ticket channel. .id. And then the status, we want to set this to opened. Okay. And I think this should automatically update it, so we don't have to call saved. Yeah, it'll give us an update result, but we won't really do anything with that. Okay. And then I can go ahead and just do console log. We'll just say updated ticket values. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this out now. So once our bot has restarted, we can go ahead and try to create a new ticket. So let me just delete all of these channels real quick. But you can see that the permissions were successfully updated because you can see that no other user that's in the server is listed on the members section, which means that they cannot see the channel. Right? In case you didn't know, if you're in a channel and you don't see the other users, that means they cannot see this channel. Okay? And if we look at the permissions, you can see that right over here for my user, I mean, I'm the admin, right? But you can see that the permissions are set correctly. And if you click on the everyone role, you can see view channel and send messages is disabled. And you can see the bot has permissions. So if you were to add any custom role, it would have the same permissions that you set earlier. So our bot successfully logged in. Let's delete this ticket channel. Let's create a ticket. And you can see that it sends a message. And let's go ahead into our database. And let's select from tickets. And you can see that, okay, so for some reason, it did not set the status to created, or it did not set the status to opened. I'm not sure why. Because it did say over here, it said updated ticket values. But for some reason, it didn't update the status though, which is really, really strange. Wait a minute, hold on. We did create the ticket right over here. Okay. And so it seems like for some reason it did not update the ticket. I don't know why. Did we oh, I think maybe I know why. Maybe we may have incorrectly queried the wrong ticket. That might be the reason why. Let me actually fix this real quick. Let me see if I can do ID, set this to save ticket.id. Maybe that might be the reason why. Because you can also pass in the actual entity itself, but I guess we should just explicitly set the ID. Let's try this again. Okay, there we go. So it seems like passing in the actual record, passing in the actual entity itself did not work. So we'll just set the ID manually to save the ticket.id. Okay, so okay, that's good. All right, perfect. So now that we are successfully updating it, if I try to create another ticket, it's going to say you already have an existing ticket, which is good, which means that we cannot create any more tickets. So we need to actually close the ticket first before we can continue. Okay, so we need to go ahead and handle the situation where we close tickets. Before I continue though, I do want to actually do this. So, I do want to wrap everything inside a try catch. So I think what I'll do is this. Because I don't like having all this code just like as is without actually handling any issues, because that's not good. So I think what I'll do is, I guess from here, or I guess the whole entire thing here. I mean, we could also just wrap this whole switch case in a try catch, but that's not. You know, I'll just do this. Const. Whoops. Let me take this whole thing. Try, and then wait. So that way, if any errors do happen, we at least know what's going on. Okay. So this should be good enough for now. But I would also recommend creating a bunch of mini functions and then like doing everything step by step. But for now, we'll leave it like this. All right, so now let's handle the case for closing the ticket. So let's go down over here and let's create another case for closing the ticket. So we need to make sure that the case matches the ID of the button, right? Because when we receive the button interaction, the custom ID will be close ticket. Okay, so we need to make sure of that. And let me also add a break statement here too. Okay, and I'll do that down here as well. Okay, so let's just go ahead and just make sure that we are able to receive the closed ticket case, or able to get into the closed ticket case. Let's write a simple console log. And what the closed ticket case needs to do is it basically needs to search for the ticket. It needs to go ahead and update the ticket and update the status and set the status to closed. Then what we need to do is we need to overwrite the permissions to make sure that the user who created the ticket can no longer see the ticket. Okay? So let's go ahead and click on the close ticket button. And you can see that we are receiving the button interaction, which is good. Okay? Now we haven't done any validation yet, so we'll have to do that. So when the user clicks on the close ticket button, what we want to do is we want to search the database for the ticket. Now, how do we search the database for the correct ticket? We can't just search by the created by property because we know that the user might have multiple different tickets. So what we want to search by is the channel ID, because we know that every single ticket is going to have a unique channel ID. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So let's do channel ID, or wait, what am I doing? Let's do const ticket equals await ticket repository find one by, and we want to search by the channel ID. Okay, and we'll get the channel ID from the interaction object. Yeah, I guess what I could also do is I could also just destructure that up there. Let me do that. Let me do this real quick. Okay, and then we can go ahead and fix this a little bit. Perfect. Okay, so we'll pass in the channel ID after destructuring the channel ID up here. Okay, so that way I don't have to do channel ID, interaction, channel ID like that, right? So we'll search for, what am I doing? Okay, there we go, channel ID. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and check to see if the ticket exists. So if the ticket does not exist, I'll just simply write a log and I'll say ticket not found, and I'll return. I could also just return this, but I think we might actually get an error somewhere. Thankfully not. Okay, that's good. Okay, I was afraid of a type error, but I'll just save some lines of code by just returning a console log. Okay, you could also do more stuff if you want to reply to the interaction, but I won't do that. I want to save as much lines as possible. So we'll do this. Okay, next what we want to do is we want to make sure that the user who's trying to close the ticket can actually close the ticket. Now, how do we know the user can actually close the ticket? Well, the user can close the ticket, and again, this is based on implementation. You don't have to do it exactly this way, but if the user has sufficient permissions or the correct roles, or if they are the person who created the ticket. So if you don't want the user to be able to close the ticket, then you can just make it so that they can't, because some people could abuse that system. But for my situation, I'll allow the user to open and close the ticket. So if you also want to make sure that they can actually close the ticket based on their role, then you'll just need to write an if condition and check to see if they have the correct role. Okay? But for now, what I'll do is I'll just check to see if the member is the actual person who created the ticket. So what we'll do is first let's actually get the member first. So we'll do this, or I should say user. So const user equals interaction dot user, and this is just going to be a user type. And what I want to do is I want to check to see if user's ID is equal to ticket.createdBy. Okay, and if this is equal, that means that the person who has created the ticket is in fact the same person who's trying to close it. And I'll just write a simple console log. I'll just say user who created ticket is now trying to close it. And then what we'll do is we will just update the status of the ticket. And that's really it. So we'll do ticket. I'll use the repository. So we'll do ticket repository, update, pass the ID of the ticket, and then status, set that to closed. That. Okay, so it does that in one line. And then finally, what we want to do is we want to update the channel's permissions. So we actually need to get the channel itself from the interaction object. So we don't have that yet, but let's grab that. So let's do this. So const channel is equal to interaction.channel. And we know that this is going to be a guild text-based channel. So we need to cast that like that. Because if we don't, it's not going to give us the correct methods that we need. Okay, so we'll do await channel.edit, which returns a promise, and we just want to set the permission overrides. And we need to go ahead and do this. I'm going to copy everything here, pieces here, and what I'll do is I'll only deny the permissions for the user who created the ticket. Everything else will stay the same, right? Because remember, if you actually only set this will literally overwrite every single permission in the channel. So you have to keep the other permissions as well. So I'm just going to leave it like this, and you can see that we're only denying view channel and send messages for the user who created it, but the Discord bot and the Discord bot will still be able to see the channel and send messages, and everyone else in the guild cannot see the channel or send messages. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that, and we'll go ahead and await interaction.reply, and we'll just say content ticket closed, and then ephemeral. Maybe we won't leave this message as ephemeral because everyone should be able to see it in the channel. So we'll leave it like that, and that should be it for closing the ticket. So let's test this out now. So let's go ahead and run the bot. And what the expected behavior should be is we should be able to create a ticket, or actually let's close the original ticket first. So let's close this ticket. Ticket closed. Now let's pay attention to the permissions, because right now it obviously makes it look like nothing actually happened because we're an admin of our server. But if I look at the permissions, you can see that the everyone permissions is the same, which is good. Bot permissions stood the same. But if you look at my permissions, view channel and send messages are still denied, which is good. Or wait, what am I saying? It's not still denied. It just got updated to be denied. Okay, now because I'm the owner of the server, I can still see the channel, right? Because as the owner, as the admin, it overrides all permissions that you set. Okay, but for an actual user, they would not be able to see the channel. Okay, but now that we've closed the ticket, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and do this. So let's go back into our roles channel, because that's where the correct message is, and we'll click on create ticket, and now we can create a new ticket right over here. Okay, let's create another one, and it says you already have an existing ticket. Okay, so if I close this now, it says ticket closed. Ticket is closed. If we look in the database, we can see that the ticket is in fact closed. So this works great. Okay, and you can go ahead and test this on an alternative Discord account if you have one, and you'll find yourself seeing that it properly works and everything that we're doing is working great. Now there obviously are a couple of things that we should fix. Well, not fix, but like add to our bot, but I'll save that for a separate video because we already finished all of the basics of our ticket bot. Okay, we're able to save the tickets to the actual database. We're able to close the tickets, and that's good. So yeah, that is going to be pretty much it for this whole tutorial. I think maybe the last thing that I'll do before I finish off this video is I'll update the component, and I'll make it so that we can disable the close ticket button because the ticket has already been closed. So what I'll do is I'll do await interaction dot update components. Let's see, and then we'll set disabled to, we'll set it to true, and then we'll just say ticket closed. And then once the ticket is closed, you can also add additional other buttons too, like transcripts, or if you want the admins to be able to do other stuff with the tickets. But let's go ahead and test this out and see how this behaves. So let's see. Let's create a new ticket. Close it. You can see it says ticket closed, and I can no longer click on it. But it is, let's see. It's throwing an error, and it's saying this reply to this action has already been sent or deferred. All right, so I think the best thing that we could do is we'll update the interaction, and then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll update the components, and then I guess we'll just send a follow-up. So I think that would work fine for us. Let's close it, and I will just say ticket closed. Okay, but I think there are different methods that you can interact with. But like I said, this is just one way to do it. You don't have to do it exactly this way. I would encourage you to figure out what you think is the best way for you to handle the situation. But as long as it updates the permissions, that's the only thing that's important. Okay, but you can see that it says ticket menu, ticket closed, and if I want to, I'll add one more button. I'll add some other additional buttons too. We'll just do this. Ticket closed. I can actually just remove this button completely. And let me just do this. Let me exit the process real quick. And we'll set the custom ID to something like create transcript. Something like this. And then we'll set the type to secondary. Create transcript. URL, something like that. You can add more buttons too. So let's do that real quick. Maybe if you want other actions too, such as, let's see, what else could we do? Delete ticket channel. Or let me call this close channel. Or actually, this is the ID. Close ticket channel. And then we'll call this close channel. And let's start up the bot again. Okay. And in another episode, I'll show you how we can handle this situation. So let's try this out. Let's click on the create ticket button, close ticket. And now you can see that we have ticket menu and then we have create transcript. Okay, so I think that'll be it for this video. I know it was really long. I think we're at like the 2-hour mark, which is really lengthy. But like I said, things like this, it's not a small project. So I don't mind going in depth and explaining everything. But what we'll do in the follow-up videos, which will be videos related to how to create transcripts, I'll show you how we can create transcripts and how we can actually save the messages to the database, and then we'll have to create an actual API to serve the actual tickets to the user, and then we'll have to create like a whole front end and stuff to actually do everything. But that'll be for a later video though. So hopefully you all enjoy this video. And if you like this video, if you learned a lot, and if you were able to successfully make it to the end and create your whole ticket bot, definitely consider subscribing or leaving a like down below. And if you have any issues, feel free to join my Discord server. The link is in the description. And additionally, all the code in this tutorial will be in the GitHub repository. So you can use that as a reference. So once again, thank you for watching, and I will see you all in my next video. Peace out.